session. Welcome to First of Tomorrow. So Roland is BBC science journalist, works on the world in action, science in action, in fact, on the World Service, and is also Swindonian, because Swindon is, as we all know, the centre of the universe. You seem to have your camera and everything working now, although you do look like you might
no,
be in
this is not working. This is I'm broadcasting, I hate to say this, live from Mars. They took me with perseverance, and I forgot to let go, and that's why I'm this extraordinary color here at the moment. So if the line breaks up, you know exactly what the problem is. We're here to talk humans. To help us talk humans, we have Professor Adam Hart and Dr. Rebecca Wragg Sykes. I'm going to introduce you to, very quickly, the first time, I don't know if Adam remembers this, the first time I met Adam, he unleashed a vicious ant on me, and it drew blood. I had no idea that a leafcutter ant could actually draw blood, and Adam had to run out of the lab. I think this is next door to get us. It wouldn't stop bleeding. Adam, you had to go and get me a plaster.
Was that in the lab, or was that in my house? I can't.
No, that was in the lab.
In the lab, yeah. No, I do vaguely remember that. From Sheffield, yeah. I think the next time I met you was in a pub in just down from the BBC at a Christmas do where we probably both had too much to drink. Was
yes, but so did you ever fill in an accident form? That's the question.
No, I probably should have though.
You probably should have done. Anyway, beware. I now know. Beware of leafcutter ants. They're fascinating creatures, but extremely dangerous. Becky.
Yes.
Have you ever injured?
I've never
intentionally
injured you,
or
no.
accidentally a journalist?
Not that I know of. Maybe through editing an article and saying I don't like that quote.
But you've never come at them. You've never come at them with a
with a hand axe.
With a stone axe.
No.
A limb bone of a Neanderthal.
Yes.
No. We wouldn't treat them in that way.
Well, I didn't think Adam would, but there you go. I don't bear grudges. It was only 20 years ago, Adam. So, so we have the two books, which I think complement each other absolutely brilliantly. I'm going to come to you, Adam, first. Yours is called Unfit. In 5 sentences, tell me what your the thesis is.
Okay, well, it's quite a playful thesis, but it's called Unfit for Purpose, and the idea is that we're a fantastic organism. There's no doubt about that. We are brilliant at many things that we do, and we've come to dominate the world. But actually, we've created around us a modern world that is in conflict really with the sort of world that we would have evolved in. And many of the problems that we have in modern life have come about in the last 20 years or so. And you can find echoes in our evolutionary past with things like why we fall for fake news, why we have addiction problems, why we have problems thinking about the future, and all that sort of thing. So it's linking together some of our evolutionary history with some of the problems that we have today, and trying to find a linkage between the two.
And Becky, we will never know, sadly, whether Neanderthals are unfit for the present day because they didn't make it. But
well, some of them has made it.
You've got a thesis in your book.
Well, yeah, I mean, some of them has made it to the present day inside most living people, in fact. So in that sense, they managed to cling on a little bit. But yeah, no, and what Kindred, my book, is about is basically bringing a fresh view on Neanderthals to people who, I'm sure, everybody's heard of the Neanderthals. They are big news all the time whenever you have a discovery, but actually there's masses of stuff that goes on in the archaeological community that most people don't really hear about. And that is, for me, the really exciting stuff. That's like the minutiae of their lives. How do we know about their technologies, about like their hearths, about how they arrange the space and how they use the whole landscape around them. And I wanted to bring all of this incredible stuff that's buried in the scientific literature from the last 30 years of massive changes in archaeology as a science, in fact, and bring that out in a way that helps people engage with the Neanderthals, because they are really popular. People are super interested in them. And I wanted to really sort of just share all of that enormous, fascinating, cool stuff in a way that people can absorb.
I mean, you say there's a lot of stuff. It's a huge amount in the book, and I saw that you said you started writing it about 8 years ago. So did you actually have to sort of keep on rewriting chapters? So much has happened in the past 8 years.
No, I didn't start writing it 8 years ago. It took me just over 3 years to write it. But I started working with my publisher 8 years ago. There was actually an intention to do a different book originally on humanity and birds in prehistory, which I would still like to do. The relationship between us and birds, because birds are everywhere. They're like the most abundant other kind of animal, and it's really fascinating. But I ended up writing the Neanderthal one first, and yeah, there was a bit of a race to kind of fit a few extra discoveries in at the end before it went to press, because certainly that's the Neanderthal sort of mill of discoveries and researchers that never stops.
No, absolutely. Adam, they hardly get a mention in your book, Neanderthals.
No, I think they did.
You really are focusing.
But yes, I didn't fold them into the already complicated story. But of course, they are very much a part of our story. So I suppose they get a mention by the fact that simply modern humans are in there, I guess. That's
but in a sense, we'll get to that wonderful stuff that's happened in the past, I guess 5 years or so, where we've started to understand the interactions between our forebears and Neanderthals. But you're very much focused on the idea that the genes and so on that we've got now were developed in evolution that was going on 100,000, 200,000, 300,000 years ago.
Oh well, and in some cases much more recently. The biggest change that we've experienced in our recent environments, our development of agriculture, which is really across the last sort of 12,000 years, and I mean that's produced evolutionary change in us that we can see in our genetic, in our genomes, whether it's the shapes of skulls, our dentition, whether it's linked to the way that we digest food or don't digest food, all of those things. If we look at evolution in its very broadest sense, which is simply a change in gene frequency over time, then yes, some of those things will be, some of the things I talk about in the book have evolved long past. I mean, we're talking about sort of flight or fight responses, which you can see in mollusks. These are deep in our evolutionary past, but equally we can see echoes of even our relatively recent evolutionary past in our genomes now.
I suppose that's quite interesting. When you say that agriculture has helped to shape our evolution, it doesn't seem, you say it's quite recent. It seems to me, I don't quite know how a gene that was useful could spread throughout a population. I mean, one of the ones you talk about in your book is, for example, is milk tolerance, lactose tolerance.
Yeah. So I mean, we in the West, particularly in northwestern Europe, have a cultural sense that milk is good. And I grew up at a time when you were basically almost force-fed milk, whether you liked it or not. Mrs. Thatcher wrongly, I found out that the chant of Thatcher milk snatcher was actually a little unfair, and in fact she wasn't entirely to blame for the removal of milk at primary school. But we very much have this idea that milk is good and calcium is good, which of course it is, for bone development, and dairy generally is good. But actually, if you look across the world, the habit of dairying, the habit of having dairy cattle around, for example, and other mammals that we can milk and drink the milk of, is not actually that prevalent. In fact, only about a third of the world have the persistence of the enzyme lactase that allows us to digest it. So what you see with the evolution of lactose tolerance, I guess, is a sort of co-evolution between a farming practice, dairying, and our genomes, and it spreads very rapidly through Europe when it takes hold, and it provides a huge advantage for people that are able to make use of this milk product, which the idea of drinking milk, and milk is literally baby food for mammals. The fact that we can drink milk as adults is an aberrance within the mammal group, but it's very, very useful. And probably the earlier, I think I used the word in the book, blessed are the cheesemakers, because it's the ability to be able to make these sort of long storage products, which probably reduce the amount of lactose sugar in milk, and allow people to sort of at least get some benefit from it. Then, of course, you start keeping more cattle, and you create an environment where the ability to be able to use that product is a huge advantage if people can do it. And tracing the genes through and across populations and linking it up with other evidence, you can really start to piece together these things. And I think that's really the sort of fascinating thing when you start reading around about some of these things. You approach it from one perspective, you know, a scientific perspective or a natural history, selection, evolution perspective, but you realize that, you know, particularly, I mean, this is Rebecca's area, but, you know, modern archaeology isn't sort of paintbrush in one hand and a sort of bag in the other and out you go. It's this linkage of like isotopes and genetics and human evolution, human history. It's folds together so nicely, and I think that's one of the things that I really enjoyed reading around to write the book.
I found, it says here my internet is unstable, but let's keep going.
You look stable enough at the moment.
I find this whole idea of being able to understand what people were doing so long ago really interesting. We talked on my program a year or two ago about them being able to scrape bits of dental plaque off remains found, I think it was in Mongolia, and they could find that there were bits of milk protein in there. I can't remember how old those were. I mean, with your fossils, Rebecca, you're looking at Neanderthals. You may be better give us a quick timeline, but you're talking about fossils that existed at least 40,000 years ago, I think.
Yeah, older. That's actually the latest date for the Neanderthals that we have. So by 40,000 years ago, it pretty much looks like they are largely gone. They emerge really as a distinctive population in terms of their anatomy by about 350,000 years ago, maybe a bit earlier. But we can actually sort of with genetics, we can estimate the point at which they split from the lineage leading to us. So we have a shared ancestor with them around 550 to 760,000 years ago, somewhere around then. And so we sort of went off, they're doing the thing, but they don't really become distinctively Neanderthal until after that. So about 350,000 years ago. So it's a really long span of time that they're around.
And they're spread across what sort of range of territory were they spread across?
Well, I think most people sort of think of Neanderthals still as European species, and that's true. They are present all across Europe, all different kinds of landscapes across Europe, but that's actually only part of their range. They really should be thought of as Western Eurasians. So we have them here in Wales, where I'm sitting, and all the way through Europe, down into the Mediterranean and the Near East, then up into Central Asia and right across into Siberia as well. And if you just add up like the square mileage, there's more of it in Asia than Europe. And there's not so many known sites in Asia, but that's probably partly to do with preservation and different geology. Like if you have a lot of caves are great for preserving stuff, but it's also about research history, and there's been a much longer focus on Europe compared to Asia.
I wasn't planning on asking this question, but if you and your Neanderthals and Adam and his earliest Homo sapiens, I don't know, 80,000 years ago or 60,000 years ago, maybe a better time, how many of each would there be in, I don't know, in Western Europe or something? Do you have any idea? Could you estimate those numbers?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually one of the really hard things to do, is to work out exactly how many there are at any one point, both as a like whole population, as a meta population, and then subpopulations, because we can see some regionality, and also like, you know, how many were living in a group at one time. So there's actually different scales to that question, but in terms of overall numbers, very few actually. There's probably no more across the whole range at any one point than 20,000, something like that. Probably the same or less for the early Homo sapiens groups, who were actually beginning to disperse out of Africa a lot earlier than used to be believed as well. People used to say, oh, we sort of left Africa around 40,000 years ago, and that's when the Neanderthals disappear. But that's not the case. We now know that we are leaving at least North Africa a lot earlier, probably by 200,000 years ago, but that may have happened in pulses. But over those spans of time, those little sort of pulses of Homo sapiens leaving Africa were probably small, even smaller than Neanderthals. But in a sense, we should expect that, because hunter-gatherers generally live at low population densities, especially in environments which are sort of, outside the tropics, where it's extremely rich and there's food all around you. You have lower population densities.
I mean, does that make sense to you, Adam? Are we really talking about numbers so fragile?
Yeah, they're surprisingly low, aren't they? But then they're not if you start thinking about our ecology, I guess, at the time, and how we would be interacting with the landscape, and also, of course, how the landscape and other organisms would have been interacting with us, because we see in present day areas of Southern Africa, for example, where we sort of originated from, we see the wildlife human conflicts that go on there now. It's a dangerous environment to be living in, and yeah, it doesn't surprise me that we're quite so low. And I guess those low numbers are a reason why that sort of build up took so long. I suppose it wasn't a sudden explosion of people across 5,000 years. It was a long, slow build up. Is that right, Rebecca? Or is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably multiple waves of people dispersing from Africa. We don't know exactly when those different waves were happening, but what we can see is that certainly the genetics tells us that there was interbreeding going on back in time, probably again at multiple times before 200,000. The earliest one is now being suggested by, because that's recent research that implies that the Neanderthals Y chromosome, so the male sex chromosome, is actually something that was taken over to Neanderthals from early interbreeding with early Homo sapiens. So that's material going that way, but there's also material going the other way from them to us at many different points in time. And what is in living people today is only one of those periods of interbreeding, we think, which happened about 50 to 55,000 years ago. Whereas
I want to get to the genomic stuff in a very short while. But I'm wondering, if you've got small numbers like that, Adam, does this, in terms of inheritance, in terms of selection of genes and so on, does it make a difference if you've got 50,000 or 50 million population that you're dealing with? Is it one way that things get really stretched?
Well, I guess at that period, yeah, if you've got fewer individuals, you have fewer chances for genomic changes to happen. But equally, you still have a selection environment, and you still have natural selection going on, and natural selection will still be selecting for the genomes that do best in those environments. So, just as, I mean, one of the reasons why viruses do so well seemingly at evolution is just because they're tremendously short generation time, and the fact that there's lots of chances and options to do that. Obviously, with humans, we have a slightly longer generation time and fewer, but you're still going to get exactly the same principles. That's really the sort of core feature of the beginning of my book, is the fact that we are animals. These processes have shaped us and continue to do so in the same fashion that anything else does, and the environment would have been the same. I think it's really interesting as well that this sort of interbreeding, I think when it was first sort of put about in the media particularly, it was almost like it was a single event, like it was almost done in a sort of slightly prurient way, that there were these couple of naughty Neanderthals and a couple of naughty,
spotted what the press do, haven't you?
We won't talk about that then, but actually the fact that this has been going on in a sort of pattern throughout, that's part of our evolutionary landscape as well.
Yeah, it's sorry, a bit of a digression from what I was planning to talk about, but I remember talking to a paleanthropologist saying that if there had been a red list of endangered species in the past, then hominids would have been on that time after time after time, and it sounds like if you're down into tens of thousands, that's the case.
I mean, 20,000 is about the same number as white rhino at the moment in southern Africa. It's that it's that sort of number.
Yeah, so
because
it doesn't take an awful
humans weren't being
to
poached by people for their horn, I guess, but yeah, it's those sorts of numbers.
Yeah, Becky, I want to tap you on this. Le Moustier, you are at Le Moustier on Twitter, so you clearly have an affection for Le Moustier, whoever, wherever that is.
It's a site. Well, to be honest, Twitter name choices are a bit random, and I don't know why I chose that one, but it is a famous Neanderthal site. It was one of the first sites that were investigated in the late 19th century. It's in southwest France, in the Dordogne region, and is actually two caves. There's like an upper shelter in this sort of bluff, this rocky bluff, which was dug in the late 19th century, and we don't know hardly anything about that because their digging methods were not super great back then. So we have some tools that came out of there, and some of those artifacts were used to define some of the first chronological classifications of the Paleolithic period. So that's like the archaeological period when everybody is still hunting and gathering, and it's before the last ice age, basically, before the end of the last ice age, I should say. So it has an importance there, but then there's a lower rock shelter as well. And that one was excavated in the early 20th century, and that became important for two reasons, because there are two known skeletons that came out of that site. One is a newborn baby, one of the youngest Neanderthals, probably just a couple of weeks old at most, and the other was a teenage, probably a boy, who may have been from around the same levels in the site, and both of them are probably chronologically very young as well, some of the latest Neanderthals in Europe, although we don't have the dates. So
these are very complete. These are very complete skeletons, aren't they?
The newborn is very complete, the teenager less so, but most of the parts of the body were there. But he appears to have been butchered and taken apart, which sounds a bit dramatic, but actually it turns out to be one of the things that we now believe Neanderthals sometimes did. Sometimes they were deposits of entire bodies, sometimes they were doing other things. But it's important for that reason, and also the tools from that lower shelter then again became part of later classifications in how we understand the sequence of different cultures that Neanderthals had, and the technologies of how Neanderthals made stone tools changed through time, and that site's part of that whole history of the development of archaeology, actually. So it's important for those reasons. Oh, Roland's paused.
We've lost Roland.
I lost him in the midst of time.
Go on, Adam.
I couldn't hear what you were saying. Right?
I was saying, go. You're about to say something. I mean, what interested me is that so you it sounds like I sort of imagine that you would just have all the hulking adults that sort of tromped across the steppe or something, but you have a complete age spectrum.
Yeah, I mean,
so you can really understand the whole lifespan.
Yeah, this is what I think a lot of people don't really understand, that we found Neanderthals were the first hominin species that we found, that we realized there was other kinds of humans in the history of the earth, and they were found in the middle of the 19th century, and they are actually the best understood really in many ways, and we have thousands of pieces of them, and they together probably relate to about 200 different individuals, which is a lot, for compared to other hominins. And as I said, that includes newborn babies through to toddlers, older children, teenagers, prime-aged adults, and then even older individuals as well, because that's a myth that they all died at the age of 30. That's definitely not true. There were older Neanderthals around. And so, we do actually understand them quite well physically, but also archaeologically. We have sort of the life history of individuals. We can see how they developed. It does look as if they may have grown slightly faster than us, but there is still debate about that. But overall, they had a pretty similar lifetime development to us. Their babies would have hit like the magic milestones and started smiling about the same time ours did, things like this. But in terms of sort of the archaeology as well, where we are with understanding how they actually lived rather than just sort of their bodies and their anatomy, that has also just like been a revolution really in terms of what we can say compared to like the 19th century, when they might have dynamited stuff out and been pleased with piles of shattered bone and a few choice pieces of stone that they kept. Now we understand that, in fact, almost everything in an archaeological site has value in terms of being able to tell us about their lives. So we keep virtually everything. Things are plotted in 3D space, so you can reconstruct the micro layers later on. Anything you find, there will be an array of techniques that allow you to target different aspects of that. So like you're talking about the dental calculus, the grot between your teeth, we can do that for Neanderthals and find out particular things they were eating, like starch residues. So we know they ate plants, things like this. You can look at other aspects of their bodies. You could, again, just with the teeth, you could look at the chemistry, the isotopic chemistry, which traces how individuals, again, diet, about what kinds of meat they were eating, but also how they moved through their lives. That can be done with isotopes and teeth. Then you can look at the wear patterns, and that tells you other ways they were actually using their teeth, whether to process materials or even the handedness of the individual. Because they used stone tools, they would hold food in their mouth and then use a stone tool to slice it. And depending on which hand.
And you talked about bone thickness in your book.
Yeah.
Tells you.
Yeah, it looks like overall they had like a genetic predisposition to have thicker bones than us, but it's probably also linked with them having extremely intensive physical lifestyles. They're hunter-gatherers, that makes sense. But what we can see there is that some of the levels of the development are sort of a similar measure to what we see in athletes today. They were extremely physically powerful, extremely fit. And we get hints as well that there are differences between the sexes in terms of how they're using their bodies. It looks like, although the samples are quite small, females, so women Neanderthals, are using their arms more often in symmetrical motion. So they're doing something with their arms that's like pulling or pushing forward with both. Whereas with men, there's more of an asymmetry, and something similar as well with the legs.
It's incredible.
Can I just ask
I mean, you're talking about behaviour here. I've got a question actually for you, Adam, if that's okay. Which is that so we talked a tiny bit about one of the kinds of the food maladaptations that you were talking about, but we're getting on to behaviour, and you have quite a lot about how the things that drove our behaviour thousands of years ago were maladapted. So you talk about stress, you talk about violence, you talk about sociality. Take us through that.
Yeah, I found the violence chapter a really tricky one to write, and it feels like the sort of thing that you could sit down now and write it differently to how you'd write it 6 months ago and in the future. And I found it tricky because we have to accept a certain fact about humans. And about mankind particularly, is that we are quite violent. We have the propensity to be violent. And when you look across the mammals generally, actually mammals are a bit more, mammals aren't, a lot of these things are quite violent. So if you look at conspecific killing, this is killing something in your own species. A lot of people think that humans are the only animals that do that, and that's simply not true. Actually, if you look across mammals, about 44% of them have good evidence for conspecific killing, and the people that did that review pretty much summarized the saying we don't really have evidence for the other 56%, but I bet if you looked, you'd find it. So it is quite common. Then if you narrow it down to primates, we are in an unusually violent clade. If we look across at other groups, there's a few other groups that are quite violent, but the primates sort of seem to emerge. But then if you sort of compare us to where we should be, it looks like the levels of violence that you can measure in society, and that's a whole different alleyway we can go down exactly how we measure it. But by a fair set of measures, it seems that we're about 7 times more violent than we might predict from where we are taxonomically, so evolutionarily. And so we have to kind of account for that. And I suppose there are a number of things. I mean, first of all, we are quite usefully put together for violence. I mean, yeah, if you imagine, I don't know, I'm trying to pick a random mammal here, like a rat or something, right? They've got some teeth and they've got a bit of brain about them, but they're not as well put together for hurting a member of their own species as we are. We are fairly useful physically. We're quite strong, and we're certainly capable of generating a lot of force. So that's the first problem. The other thing, of course, is that we've got a very good and adaptable brain. We're able to use our environment. We're able to make tools and weapons.
Think of clever ways of
inevitably most
hurting
of the
people.
sorry.
Think of clever ways of hurting people.
Yeah, and of course, a lot of the a lot of our archaeological finds are often interpreted as weapons. You find an axe head, and people are sort of saying, "Oh, they would have used this to kill people," or of course they could use it like I use an axe for, as a tool. I don't know. Sort of, everything's sort of interpreted through this kind of glamorous lens of violence sometimes, but nonetheless, we have this sort of violent tendency. But what I found really interesting was the fact that actually what you can see in a lot of psychological work is investigations into mechanisms that reduce our violent tendency, because the reality is most of us aren't going around tearing lumps out of each other. Most of us aren't doing that, and you can construct very plausible evolutionary scenarios that absolutely fit with behavioral ecology and evolutionary ecology that you look at in other species. Violent individuals that get access to breeding females, for example, or gain social status as a consequence and therefore gain more mates. And of course, if there's a genetic component to it, you can stitch all this stuff together, and for sure at certain points in our past and even in the present day, violence is a very useful way to solve certain problems. But the dominant
it doesn't make sense to me, Adam. It doesn't make sense to me, Adam, in this sense that we're a social species.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't know what the Neanderthals were like, but our success
exactly
as a species seems to depend entirely on the fact that we work together.
It's this complete balance,
I guess that's this tension that we talk about.
It's this complete balance between yes, we have this capacity to be violent, and seemingly we do have a tendency towards that, but equally you're right, we can't act socially, and we can't interact with people, and we can't have the success that we do if we don't moderate that in some way. So whilst we can talk about selection for aggression, selection for violent behavior, equally we must have had selection for mediation, for some people have even suggested that guilt and emotions like that have evolved as a mechanism to somehow temper our violent tendencies, and it's a complex minefield when it comes down to it, because we're trying to make inferences on all sorts of things that we don't have solid data for. I found very convincing studies that suggest that we are more violent than we used to be, that we are less violent than we used to be, and that we are exactly as violent as we've ever been. And everyone will stand over those and say that they're right. It's a very difficult set of things to try and bring together. But what is very clear is that in the modern world, violence is a scourge. It is a problem. I think as a woman, you're more likely to be killed by your partner than you are to be killed by anyone else. We see domestic violence. We see violence against children. We see group violence. We have genocide. We have war. We can't sort of say, oh, there's a gene for it and blame it at that, but we can nonetheless start to piece together something that suggests that perhaps there have been points in our evolutionary history where there have been selection for mechanisms that lead towards that. But yeah, it's a balance. We are obviously,
and we just celebrate all the refined. We just celebrate all the refined things that we do. And we say that Neanderthals, they were the thugs. They were all heavily built. They're obviously just going out braiding each other. Actually, I do have here, Becky, someone asked me, you talked a bit earlier about butchering. Is there some evidence of rituals around butchering? What is the record? I think they're talking here about that, the boy that you're talking about earlier. But you say that they don't deserve their reputation for being thugs, Neanderthals.
No, the issue over basically what we would call a mortuary practice, so like what one does with the dead, is a separate issue, I think, because we've had a bit of a focus on really Western ways of treating the dead, like did they dig a grave, and was the body laid out straight in the grave, and did it have stuff in there with it? And if it doesn't, then, well, we can't say much about it. There's plenty of other ways of dealing with the dead all around the world today that are socially meaningful, that have, contexts that are about care, about emotional connection. And so I think that if we see butchery of the dead, possibly eating of the dead, in some cases we can see like tooth marks and things, not always, and potential reuse of objects made from the bodies of the dead. That is actually only freaky if you're looking from a very Western Christian perspective. In fact, even recent, because Christianity itself has a massive tradition of bits and pieces of the dead that people like to hang on to or build entire catacombs out of. So, I think what was going on in terms of bodies being taken apart is a specific argument, and that should be laid to one side. But is there evidence that Neanderthals were just fundamentally violent towards each other? I don't think there really is.
Is there evidence against it, in the sense that you would expect to see evidence if they were?
Yeah, well, yes, you would. What we can say is that a lot of Neanderthals, although not all, had injuries at some points in their lives.
There are parts of your book I had to skip over, I'm afraid, and the injuries was one of them.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, I mean, like, a lot of Neanderthals had sort of broken bones, things like this, different injuries, illnesses. But if you look at what hunter-gatherers deal with in terms of poor health, it's not very different. And on top of that, if you want to prove violence between individuals, then you have to get forensic about it, and you have to say, okay, which forms of injury and which parts of the body are likely to be from somebody battering you, basically. And when you apply that criterion, there is not an awful lot in Neanderthals compared to early Homo sapiens. It's about the same. And some of the things that, like, oh, well, there's a blunt force trauma on the head. Well, that could be a hunting injury, because let's face it, they were up close with some massive beasts. And some of these injuries may well just be day-to-day living. Again, we see that in hunter-gatherers. Like, a lot of work's been done on sort of injury rates and things in different hunter-gatherers. And a lot of the time people are just falling over and breaking their bones because it's extremely physical. So if you take
clumsy rather than violent.
Well, just unlucky. Yeah. I mean, if you take a fair view, there isn't great evidence. And I would say that the archaeology itself, so how they lived, argues against it, because everything we see from the way that they're using materials all around them, how they are taking animals apart, how they must have been hunting cooperatively, how when they hunt, they systematically take the carcass apart. It's not like a free-for-all like you see with hyenas, with everyone snapping at everyone and tearing it apart. It's very systematic and carefully done. They take the best parts away to other places to process, and they're being given and shared around in groups. So that sort of social basis of sharing is, again, extremely similar to what we see in most hunter-gatherers, where it's actually about commonality of resources. So on that basis, I don't think we should argue that Neanderthals had any kind of fundamental aggressive substrate to their social groups. I don't think there's the evidence for it. I don't think we should assume that. And also, people quite often will look at chimpanzees, for example, as primates. And Adam was talking about primates and violence and things like this. And chimps are pretty full on. And chimpanzees, I mean, not bonobos, this is the distinction. Chimpanzees have male-dominated, extremely violent, aggressive societies. It's so bad that when the females give birth, they go and do it by themselves because they're worried the baby's going to be killed. It's really full on. If you look at pygmy chimpanzees, so they're called bonobos, very, very close relation to chimpanzees, it's completely different. That society is based around friendships, affiliations, it's female dominated, and when there's conflict, it's made up with like physical caresses. There's a lot of shagging that goes on, basically, because it's a social means to kind of like settle everybody down. And what's really interesting about the argument in terms of us and violence and things is that I just heard the other day a talk by Brian Hare, where he said that if you compare the reproductive success of bonobo males, the friendliest bonobo males are more successful in terms of numbers of babies that they have than the most violent alpha chimpanzee males, which is not what you would expect at all. So that's fascinating, and it just shows the complexity of looking contextually at different sort of social structures. And again, we should not assume that all Neanderthals are the same either.
When Neanderthals were first being explored, did this idea that they were sort of thuggish and brutish, did that come about almost immediately and just settled down and that's what everyone thought? Or was it a more gradual kind of evolution of that idea?
I think it emerged pretty soon, because as soon as the Neanderthals were found and people were, looking at the skulls and things and going, oh, what is this? They were instantly compared to extant hunter-gatherer groups in the 19th century. And all of those groups, without exception, were framed literally as savage, brutal, in the sense of animalistic. And being unable to have like higher concerns, being unable to control themselves emotionally. So Neanderthals were absolutely from the start framed that way, because there was already this extreme racist structure in place in the first instance.
Just slotted in.
Yeah, but at the same time, there was one of the early sites that was found in the late 19th century. It's called Krapina in Croatia, and that was the first site where there was evidence of butchery, of the bodies being taken apart and smashed up and things like that. So that did get in people's minds as well quite early, I think.
Okay, we've got to wind up pretty soon. I want to squeeze in. I got so many questions I wanted to ask, but we've got some on Hoover here. One for you, Adam. If we are, quotes, unfit for purpose due to how we've evolved versus what the modern world looks like, what does our ideal world habitat look like? And if I can add to that, in a sense, evolution's never about perfection. It's just about good, my sort of rule of thumb.
No, I mean, we're wonderfully fit for purpose if you think about global domination and our ability to live almost anywhere. We do very well at it. What my book's getting at really is that with the modern world, we've created, for example, an environment of highly concentrated, potent food environment, right? Where I can go down to the shop and for £2, I can probably buy a week's worth of calories if I just buy lard and sugar. That's not an environment that our bodies are good with. We don't have this metabolic boy and girl scout thing where we're just saving up for a famine that never comes. There's really no evidence for that. Actually, it looks like it's more the case that our upper weight limits just drifted as predation was eased off as we evolved. That seems to be the dominant idea.
Sort of saber-toothed tigers.
Yeah, there was a sort of extinction of many of those predators around, sort of megafauna predators around the same time. And of course, we then started working together and living together in more coherent groups, which probably helped for defending ourselves against predators and so on. So there's this. It's really the idea. Yeah, I mean, evolution absolutely doesn't produce. Perfection is the enemy of achievement when it comes to most things, and that's certainly the case when you look at natural selection and evolution. It's the best thing that's available right now. It's just that right now the world around us looks massively different. It's much more potent and concentrated, whether it's social media, whether it's alcohol and drugs, whether it's fake news, whether it's information. However we look at the world, our brains are not really, and our bodies haven't really been. We have no selection environment for that level of potency. Our selection environment was even 200 years ago was very different from now. And of course, we have linked to that the fact that we have removed ourselves from a lot of the brutality of natural selection.
Well, having to listen to Becky, I'm just sorry that we're here and that these nice cultured art.
I know they sound so much better.
I'm sure they had their moments as well.
Rod, I'm going to hand back to you now. It's been brilliant talking to both of you. Thank you so much. Excellent book too.
Yes, thank you to both of you, and actually to Roland as well for sharing that. That was fantastic. Despite the fact you look like you were coming from the
beetroot.
So if you do want to get a copy of Rebecca's book Kindred, Neanderthal Life, Love, Death and Art, or Adam's book Unfit for Purpose, you can find them both and many others in our festival bookstall. There's an exhibitor booth on the Hoover app or on our website. You can find those, and part of the proceeds in those do go to independent bookstores, and particularly one in Devizes in Wiltshire. Coming up next at 8:10, BBC Radio Shivani Dave will be chatting to music writer and self-professed astronomy geek Jonathan Scott, author of The Vinyl Frontier, Story of NASA's Interstellar Mixtape, and then there is a pub quiz, adults-only pub quiz. After that, for 20 minutes, it's a bit of a laugh, not too serious, and we'll be back again for some amazing talks and shows again tomorrow. So thank you all. I'm going to stop now before we get cut off by Hoover. Thanks again to all the audience for your questions and to all our speakers. Thanks a lot.